is awesome to be here this morning. When was the last time you listened to your neighbor's voice? Really heard it? Not a nod or a wave, but when was the last time you appreciated who they are? Here's what I mean. It was more than a decade ago that I attended a first meeting of a Muslim-Jewish women's dialogue group. And the woman sitting across from me had a provocative first name. It was jihad, which in Arabic means holy war or a struggle in the way of God. Imagine that. Who would name their daughter jihad? And what would it be like to go through life with such an identity? Jihad explained, she was born during what we as Jews call Israel's War of Independence. Her father was fighting in the war. He came home for a visit. Her grandmother asked him, "What do you want to name your newborn daughter?" And he said, "There's no time for naming. We're in the midst of jihad, a sacred struggle for what is right." That's how jihad got her name. The Palestinians lost that war, and Jihad's family and many Palestinian families would lose their homes. Hearing her story felt like an attack on the Jewish people. "You do not understand," my heart cried out to itself in an effort to negate her story. The Arabs rejected compromises for peace, and our own Jewish people, we experienced tremendous loss and pain as well. In my mind, I recounted the Holocaust, how 6 million Jews were murdered, a large part of my own family. I was named for my grandfather's sister, Judy Schindler, who was murdered by the Nazis when she was 32 years old. And this past summer, I was in Berlin and I saw 7 memorial stones outside the home where she lived in the sidewalk. 7 stones reflecting 7 lives stolen by the Holocaust. Her stone reads, "Here lived Judith Steinberg, born Judith Schindler, 1910, deported September 5th, 1942 to Riga, murdered September 8th, 1942. She, her husband, who was 34, her 5 children ranging in ages from 10 to 2, were transported on cattle cars with 783 other people to Riga. They were marched to a forest where they were shot." My heart and my mind wondered, how could I relate to jihad, to her pain and perspective, when I carried with me my own profound pain and strong views? And how could I expect jihad, a proud Palestinian, to understand what Israel means to me and my people? It was our home, our only haven, the place we'd been connected for thousands of years. We had revitalized for nearly a century. We'd been given international sanctions for sovereignty. Something moved Jihad and I to exchange numbers with a plan to meet for coffee and conversation and perhaps even strike a friendship, neighbor to neighbor. So today, I would describe Jihad as a caring and dedicated pharmacist, as a loving mother to 6 children, and as a supremely proud grandmother to 10 grandchildren. Actually 14, that number goes up and up. Good for her family. But more importantly, today I know Jihad. I better understand her voice and her pain. Now, I've been thinking a lot about jihad lately. Not holy war, but my friend, jihad. Because we seem to live in this age where reaching across lines of difference is not something we are inclined to do. We like to stay safe. within the communities with which we identify. We like to stay safe within the echo chambers of our own social media. And while our government debates the virtue of building walls, my experience with jihad has taught me that there's something far more important we can build, and that is transformative understanding across beliefs, cultures, and religions. And it all starts with a very basic building block. The building block of mastering the art of loving your neighbor. More than a dozen faiths teach this common ethic. Billions of our global neighbors embrace what many of us would call the golden rule. Never do to others what you would not want them to do to you, the Chinese sage Confucius taught. And the Buddha and his disciples in the Udana, they teach the same. In the Quran, Muhammad teaches this love your neighbor ethic as a key to salvation. And in my faith, in Judaism, at the center of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is a commandment in Hebrew, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But as is evidenced from my meeting with jihad, living it is complex. It requires vulnerability, it requires empathy, and most of all, it requires courage. The first step to mastering the art of loving our neighbor, it requires vulnerability. Now, 2 years ago, I changed jobs. For 18 years, I'd been a rabbi at Temple Beth El with 2,500 congregants, and I was so comfortable with people largely like me streaming through the open doors of my office. And then I moved jobs. I moved to a Presbyterian university to be a professor of Jewish studies and to run a center for peace and social justice. And I worked on a floor where professors study quietly in their offices. But in my role, as I stepped further and further outside my comfort zone, I encountered perspectives and people I never would have encountered before. Here's one small example. There's a professor 4 doors down, and I was in his office talking about the challenges of raising teenage boys with all their curfew and boundary testing antics. And he shared with me the challenges of raising his kids, and he capped off his stories with a story about his younger son, Neville, who has Down syndrome. So here we have this professor of philosophy, of complex and critical thought, and his son, Neville, it takes him a long time to master the basics. But his son taught my colleague gratitude. You see, Neville's excited about everything: the food he's eating, the person he's with, the TV show he is watching. His wonder taught his dad how to savor life, and that is a lesson that I need to learn and live, not only in parenting, but in being a person. The journey to mastering the art of loving our neighbor, it requires empathy. The ability to hear views beyond our own views and to understand our neighbor's pain. You see, when we only listen to our own voice, we miss so much. You know those voices inside our heads that chatter when we experience someone who's not quite like us? It might be their clothes, or their body, or their skin color, or their religion, or their politics. So how do we get beyond our discomfort with difference? Jihad and I, we started with the basics: the coffee in our hands, the city we live in, the family that we love. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to look at the world through a different lens when I was invited to be a part of a clergy support group for a mother, Mrs. Georgia Farrell. She was going through the trial of an officer who was accused of using excessive force in the death of her unarmed 24-year-old son, Jonathan. And I arrived at the courthouse on the first day, and I sat in the courtroom and I learned that Jonathan was in a car wreck. It was at night. He was disoriented and he knocked on a door, and the woman, as any of us would call the police in the middle of the night. And the police arrived on the scene and mistook Jonathan's intention, a young officer, and he shot Jonathan 10 times even after he was down. I was awed by Mrs. Farrell's faith and her fortitude. And the courtroom adjourned for lunch, and I went up and I introduced myself to Mrs. Farrell, and she introduced me to her large support network of family and friends. And I said to her, Mrs. Farrell, you have so much family here today. Why don't I come back another day and take you out to lunch? And she said to me, Rabbi Judy, you are family. And from that moment through today, we remain strongly connected. Religion as well reminds us of this need to see beyond our own views. You see, in our city, we have 1,000 houses of worship, and the majority are Christian. But you know what? They vary as greatly as the 160 countries from which our county's school children come. It certainly is no surprise that there is so much division amongst us, because that difference can create and breed ignorance that leads to perceived danger and then further distance. The one antidote? Being committed to learning about your neighbor's differences so that you can find common ground. And lastly, the journey to mastering the art of loving your neighbor, it requires courage. The courage to be curious and the courage to stand up for your neighbor. I'm reminded of a village, and a villager saw someone drowning and thrashing in the waters of a river nearby, and he jumped into the river and brought that person to safety. The village decided to hire some lifeguards. And every couple of days, someone was drowning in the river, and a lifeguard jumped in and brought that person to safety and was hailed as a hero. And the village started to put a lot of resources into lifeguards. When someone finally said, why don't we look upstream and see why people are falling into the river in the first place? Loving your neighbor requires looking upstream and working to eradicate root causes of your neighbor's hardship that prevent them from falling into those waters of hard times in the first place. Advocacy can take many forms. One letter to the editor can change many minds. One post on social media can spread facts rather than fear. One call to a senator or representative can change a policy. So why do we need to speak out? Because we are inextricably linked to our neighbors. Our well-being depends on them, and their well-being depends on us. This value was underscored for me on International Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2016. Because on that day was the president's first executive order on immigration. And it banned citizens from 7 Muslim-majority countries from entering our country for at least 90 days. That was on January 27th. The next day, on January 28th, a mosque in Victoria, Texas was burnt to the ground. And a congregant posted the news story on Facebook and tagged me and said, Rabbi Judy, what do we do? And then the next day, a shooter went into a mosque in Quebec City and killed 6 and wounded 8. And it was then that I got a suggestion from a Muslim female leader. She said, you know, Wednesday, which was just 3 days away, is World Hijab Day, where Muslims and non-Muslim women are invited to stand in solidarity with their Muslim sisters by putting on a hijab for the day. So I went into my closet and I grabbed a scarf. I found a YouTube video and learned how to tie a hijab. I posted it on social media and invited everyone to join with me. And 4 of my students from my Holocaust class, they wrote me and said, can we ever ride uptown to the rally? We want to come. And they tied beautiful hijabs and looked gorgeous, and they made signs. And one sign said, I am my sister's keeper. Another sign said, no hate, no fear. Refugees are welcome here. And when we got to the rally, I met up with Jihad. And I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, and we hugged, and she took me around to her family and introduced me to her children and grandchildren and said proudly, this is my friend, Rabbi Judy. Now, a rabbi wearing a hijab elicited positive responses. Some people shared with me their beautiful stories of the connections that were created when they wore a hijab for the day. And a rabbi wearing a hijab elicited hateful responses. Someone even called the temple where I had worked and am an emerita, and they said, I hope Rabbi Judy gets raped. It flipped me out. I had to meet with the police, and I had to learn how to look in the rearview mirror on my way home to be sure that I wasn't being followed. Sometimes standing up for our neighbor can be scary. But living in a world where we fail to summon the courage to stand up for our neighbor creates a world that is far scarier, one where we fail to see the human bonds that unite us. A rabbi in a yeshiva in a Jewish school, he asked his students, how do you know that moment when night has ended and day has begun? And one student, he raised his hand and he said, you know that night has ended and day has begun when you can tell the difference between a goat and a sheep. You can tell this takes place in Israel. And another student raised his hand and said, you know that night has ended and day has begun when you can tell the difference between an olive tree and a fig tree. And the rabbi said, those are all wonderful answers. But I believe when you see 3 men walking towards you, and one of them is dark-skinned, and one of them is olive-skinned, and one of them is light-skinned, and you say, these are my brothers. And when you see 3 women walking towards you, and one is Jewish, and one's Christian, and one's Muslim, and you say, these are my sisters, then night has truly ended, and day has begun. Thank you.